In 1915, on the quiet banks of the Rouge River in Dearborn, Michigan, a mansion stood complete. It did not tower like a European palace. It did not glitter with marble domes or gilded statues. Instead, it stretched low and deliberate across the land built of limestone and brick, grounded rather than grand. This was Fair Lane, the private estate of Henry Ford. At the time, Ford was one of the most powerful industrial figures in the world. Through Ford Motor Company, he had transformed manufacturing forever. The moving assembly line, introduced just 2 years earlier, had reduced the time it took to build a car from over 12 hours to barely 90 minutes. The Model T had made the automobile accessible to ordinary families. Factories were no longer chaotic workshops. They were systems, precise, measured, controlled. Ford believed that waste, of time, of motion, of energy, was a moral failing. Efficiency was not merely practical, it was righteous. And Fair Lane would embody that belief. The estate covered more than 1,300 acres of land along the Rouge River. Forests, fields, gardens, and most importantly, a hydroelectric powerhouse built directly into the property. Ford diverted part of the river to flow through turbines that generated electricity for the house. The symbolism was unmistakable. The mansion would not depend on the outside world, it would produce its own power. Self-sufficiency meant control. Control meant security. Even the land itself was arranged with intention. Gardens were designed in strict botanical order, trees were planted deliberately, pathways curved with careful geometry. Nature was not left wild. It was guided, structured, optimized. Ford distrusted unpredictability. He disliked disorder. He believed that chaos could be corrected through design. The mansion contained 56 rooms spread across long wings. The architecture blended prairie style with restrained European influence, but it avoided excessive ornamentation. Unlike the marble estates of other Gilded Age magnates, Fair Lane projected something quieter: authority. It did not scream wealth. It demonstrated power through restraint. Its location was strategic, close enough to the enormous Rouge plant for Ford to reach it easily, far enough to escape the smoke and noise of Detroit's industrial core. It was not a retreat from industry, it was an extension of it. Inside, the house moved with deliberate calm. Rooms flowed into one another without clutter. Windows captured natural light with precision. Materials were chosen for durability, not extravagance. Clara Ford, Henry's wife, softened the interior. She selected warm fabrics and comfortable furniture. She preferred elegance without ostentation. Without her influence, the house might have felt clinical. But even Clara's warmth existed inside Henry's philosophy. Meals often reflected his dietary theories. Soybeans, whole grains, vegetables grown on the estate. Ford believed nutrition shaped character. Food was fuel. Fuel should be improved. Dinner conversations frequently returned to efficiency, productivity, reform. Even in private, Ford was refining systems. Fair Lane was not built to impress aristocrats. It was built to demonstrate an idea. Ford believed environment shaped behavior. If factories could eliminate wasted motion through design, homes could eliminate social and moral inefficiency the same way. Structure could improve people. Architecture could influence character. Water flowed through turbines outside. Electricity lit the rooms. Servants moved according to defined routes. Guests entered spaces carefully arranged to create calm authority. Everything had purpose. Nothing was accidental. From a distance, the mansion seemed peaceful, but peace at Fair Lane was engineered. And within its limestone walls, an idea settled firmly into stone. Life itself could be optimized. If a factory could be perfected, perhaps society could be perfected too. The mansion under the river was not simply a home, it was the first experiment, and it would not be the last. Fair Lane was designed to feel effortless. That was the illusion. Guests walked through wide halls filled with natural light. They saw polished wood, quiet fireplaces, carefully placed furniture. They heard the faint sound of water turning turbines outside. What they did not see was the second architecture. Behind the limestone walls ran narrow corridors and hidden staircases. Doors blended into panelling so seamlessly they disappeared when shut. Service routes connected kitchens to dining rooms, bedrooms to laundry spaces, mechanical rooms to living areas, all without crossing the visible paths of guests. The mansion was built so that labour could vanish. Invisibility was not an accident. It was policy embedded in design. In service areas, bellboards lined the walls. Each bell corresponded to a specific room. When one rang, a servant responded immediately. There was no hesitation, no improvisation. The system reduced uncertainty. Time mattered here just as it did at the Rouge plant. A household staff of dozens kept the estate functioning. Cooks prepared meals according to specific preferences. Maids cleaned and reset rooms before anyone noticed disorder. Gardeners maintained hundreds of acres through harsh Michigan winters and humid summers. Engineers monitored the hydroelectric system that powered the estate. The property was not merely lived in. It was operated. Schedules were strict. Duties were separated. Movement was minimized. The same logic that had perfected the assembly line shaped the rhythm of domestic life. Henry Ford believed that inefficiency weakened systems. He saw no reason why private life should be exempt from improvement. Even meals became part of his philosophy. Ford was deeply invested in diet reform. He promoted soy products and whole grains. He believed food influenced productivity and moral discipline. Guests at Fair Lane sometimes found themselves gently corrected about what they ate or how they ate. Optimization did not end at the factory gates. Heating systems were tested and adjusted. Lighting arrangements were modified. Materials were evaluated for longevity and cost. Fair Lane functioned partly as residence and partly as laboratory. It reflected Ford's conviction that design could reshape behavior. Clara Ford introduced warmth into this structure. She chose fabrics that softened rooms. She hosted gatherings that emphasized hospitality rather than hierarchy. Former staff later described her as kind and attentive, but kindness lived inside a rigid framework. Servants were expected to appear instantly when summoned and disappear just as quickly. They were not to linger in hallways or draw attention. Their role was to maintain perfection without becoming visible within it. Professionalism meant erasure. Employment at Fair Lane paid relatively well. Some staff remained for years. Stability was possible, yet it was conditional. Henry Ford could be generous, but he was also unpredictable. A minor mistake might be forgiven, or it might result in dismissal. Expectations were clear until they shifted without warning. The house operated smoothly because everyone inside accepted rules they had not written. Order depended on compliance. From the outside, Fair Lane seemed like a sanctuary from industrial chaos. From the inside, it felt like a smaller, quieter factory. And within its hidden corridors, Ford refined a belief that would soon expand far beyond his estate. If architecture can guide movement, it can guide lives. If environment shapes conduct, then design becomes moral force. The invisible roots inside Fair Lane were not just about servants, they were about control. And soon that control would move beyond walls, beyond gardens, beyond private property. It would reach entire streets. In 1914, the same year construction began at Fair Lane, Henry Ford announced what many newspapers called the most generous wage in American industry: $5 a day. At a time when most factory workers earned less than half that amount, the offer seemed revolutionary. Thousands travelled to Detroit seeking work at Ford Motor Company. Lines formed outside factory gates. Families saw possibility where before there had only been survival. But the $5 day was not simply a raise, it was a system. Workers did not automatically receive the full wage. To qualify, they had to meet standards set by a newly created department inside the company, the sociological department. Its purpose, officially, was to improve lives. Its methods went further. Inspectors visited workers' homes. They checked for cleanliness. They evaluated spending habits. They asked about alcohol consumption. They examined how children were raised, whether families attended school and church regularly, whether money was saved responsibly. The line between employer and guardian blurred. Ford believed higher wages meant little if workers wasted their income. In his view, disorder at home weakened discipline at work. Environment shaped behaviour, and behaviour shaped productivity. The same belief that guided Fair Lane now extended into ordinary neighbourhoods. Soon, Ford invested in worker housing in Dearborn. Rows of brick homes were constructed near the Rouge plant. Small yards, indoor plumbing, gas stoves, running water. For many families coming from overcrowded tenements, the houses felt miraculous. They were clean, safe, orderly, but they were also tied directly to employment. Lose your job, lose your home. Security existed, but it was conditional. Rent payments flowed through the same system that issued wages. Employment and shelter were intertwined. Stability depended on compliance both inside the factory and outside it. The houses were beautiful in their uniformity, lawns trimmed, windows aligned, streets symmetrical, but uniformity was not aesthetic alone, it was moral. Inspectors could walk these streets and evaluate conformity at a glance. Neighbours knew that disorder might invite scrutiny. A rumour about drinking could trigger investigation. A poorly maintained yard could raise questions. The homes provided comfort and observation. Some workers welcomed the structure. The sociological department offered advice on budgeting, language classes for immigrants, even assistance during family hardship. In many cases, the guidance was practical and genuinely helpful, but it was never neutral. The company was not merely paying wages, it was defining standards. The mansion philosophy had scaled up. At Fair Lane, servants moved invisibly through corridors designed to control motion. In Dearborn, workers lived inside streets designed to control behaviour. Architecture had become policy. Henry Ford believed he was building better citizens. He believed he was eliminating waste not just in factories, but in private life. And for a time, the system appeared to work. Productivity soared, workers stayed longer, homes remained tidy. But beneath the order ran quiet tension. A dismissal from the factory could mean eviction within days. A disagreement on the assembly line could ripple outward into a family stability. The $5 day promised independence. The system behind it deepened dependence. The houses looked permanent, but their security was fragile, and as Ford's confidence in environmental engineering grew, his ambition expanded beyond Michigan. If structured streets could shape workers, if disciplined homes could shape families, then perhaps an entire city could be built from scratch, designed not only to house labour, but to reshape culture itself. The next experiment would not unfold on brick-lined streets. It would rise from jungle soil. By the late 1920s, Henry Ford faced a vulnerability he could not tolerate: rubber. Every automobile that rolled off the assembly line at the Rouge plant depended on it. Tyres, gaskets, seals, hoses, and nearly all of it came from British and Dutch plantations in Southeast Asia. Ford did not like dependence. He distrusted foreign control over materials essential to his empire. If he could produce his own steel, generate his own electricity, and structure his own workforce, why should rubber be different? The solution in his mind was straightforward: grow it himself. In 1928, Ford acquired approximately 2.5 million acres of land in the Brazilian Amazon. The project would be called Fordlândia. It would not simply be a plantation, it would be a city. American managers arrived carrying blueprints drafted in Michigan. Streets were laid out in rigid grids. Houses were built in familiar Midwestern styles: wooden siding, pitched roofs, front porches. A hospital was constructed, a school, a golf course, a water tower stamped with the Ford name. It looked less like Brazil and more like Dearborn transplanted into the rainforest. Ford believed American methods were universal. Efficiency did not depend on geography. Order did not depend on culture. The jungle, in his view, was raw material waiting to be organized. Workers were expected to adopt American routines. Cafeterias served oatmeal and canned goods. Alcohol was prohibited. Traditional Brazilian foods were discouraged. Recreation was structured around square dances and scheduled activities designed to promote discipline. But the jungle operated by different rhythms. Rubber trees thrived when tapped before dawn in cooler temperatures. Ford's managers, trained in factory logic, imposed standardized work shifts that ignored local agricultural knowledge. Disease spread quickly. Malaria moved through housing areas. Mosquitoes swarmed near the riverbanks where many workers lived. American managers occupied better ventilated houses on higher ground. The hierarchy was architectural. The layout of the town reflected the layout of power. Fordlândia was Fair Lane expanded to thousands of acres, an entire environment designed to shape behaviour. But one fatal flaw undermined the project. In Southeast Asia, rubber plantations were spaced carefully to prevent disease. In Brazil, Ford's planners copied the dense plantation model without understanding local ecology. South American leaf blight, a fungus native to the Amazon, spread rapidly through tightly packed trees. Entire groves failed. Local experts had warned of the risk. Their advice was dismissed. Confidence in system overrode experience on the ground. Frustration among workers grew. Food felt foreign. Rules felt intrusive. Supervisors rarely spoke Portuguese fluently. Cultural expectations were imposed rather than negotiated. In December 1930, tensions erupted. The breaking point came in the cafeteria. New serving policies required workers to line up in factory-style shifts for meals. Trays replaced communal dining. Efficiency was applied even to eating. Plates began to fly. Tables overturned. Windows shattered. American managers reportedly fled toward the river, watching from boats as workers tore through the cafeteria in protest. Order was restored eventually by Brazilian authorities. But something fundamental had broken. The belief that environment alone could reshape people had met resistance. Ford doubled down, investing in a second site called Belterra. The same problems followed: disease, poor yields, rising costs. And through it all, Henry Ford never visited the Amazon. He directed the experiment from Michigan, studying reports, issuing instructions, confident that the system would eventually correct itself. It never did. In 1945, Ford sold the entire operation back to the Brazilian government at a massive loss. The jungle remained. The town remained. But the dream of exporting industrial order into the rainforest collapsed. The mansion philosophy had reached its limit. You could redirect a river, you could design a house, you could inspect a neighborhood, but you could not command the jungle, and you could not fully engineer human culture. The empire of control had expanded as far as it could. Soon it would begin to dim. While Henry Ford was reshaping factories and exporting his philosophy to the Amazon, his son was building a very different kind of house. On the shores of Lake St. Clair stood Gawkler Point, the estate of Edsel Ford and his wife Eleanor. Where Fair Lane emphasized restraint and mechanical precision, Gawkler Point embraced warmth and artistry. Designed by architect Albert Kahn, the house drew inspiration from English Cotswold cottages, hand-cut stone, leaded glass windows, gardens that flowed naturally toward the water. It felt softer, more human. Edsel Ford had grown up inside his father's system. He inherited not only wealth, but expectation. As president of Ford Motor Company, he carried responsibility for one of the largest industrial enterprises in the world. But he was not Henry. Edsel loved modern art. He supported artists like Diego Rivera. He appreciated European design and architectural experimentation. He believed automobiles could be elegant, not just efficient. These tastes clashed with his father's rigid pragmatism. Henry Ford valued utility. Edsel valued beauty. The tension between them extended beyond boardrooms. At Gawkler Point, Edsel created something his father never quite approved of, a home shaped not purely by efficiency, but by aesthetic vision. The walls displayed contemporary art that Henry found suspicious. Rooms were arranged for conversation rather than discipline. The gardens were designed less as controlled systems and more as living landscapes. Yet even this softer estate remained tied to the empire that funded it. From the terraces overlooking the lake, one could see distant industrial glow rising from the Rouge plant. The furnaces never truly went dark. The assembly lines continued moving. The beauty of Gawkler Point was sustained by the machinery of Dearborn. Edsel struggled under the weight of dual identities, heir and executive, son and subordinate. His ideas for the company were often overruled. His authority undermined by managers loyal directly to his father. Stress mounted. His health deteriorated. He died in 1943 at just 49 years old, years before Henry. The gilded cage had offered comfort. It had not offered freedom. Even within the family, the philosophy of control cast a shadow. The empire did not only shape workers and distant labourers, it shaped the heir. Eleanor Ford remained at Gawkler Point after Edsel's death. She understood the fragility of such estates. Without protection, the property could be subdivided, sold, erased. In 1976, she donated the estate to a public trust. The gates opened. What had once been private became accessible. Rooms once reserved for family dinners now welcomed school groups and visitors. Gardens once guarded by exclusivity became public space. A house built from industrial power shifted into shared memory. And slowly, the mansion empire began transforming, not collapsing in fire, not shattering in scandal, but softening, opening, reinterpreting itself. The structures remained, the authority weakened. Henry Ford had built spaces to shape lives. Time was beginning to reshape the spaces. On April 7th, 1947, Henry Ford died at Fair Lane. A storm had swept through Dearborn. The Rouge River flooded, knocking out the hydroelectric system that powered the estate. The man who had built his home to be self-sufficient, who had diverted a river to generate his own electricity, passed away by candlelight. The symbolism was quiet, almost cruel. The empire of control could not control the weather. He was 83. Clara Ford died 3 years later. And Fair Lane, once humming with disciplined activity, grew still. For a time, Ford Motor Company maintained the estate. But a 56-room mansion designed for a singular industrial will did not easily adapt to modern life. No heir wished to live inside that shadow. Eventually, the property was donated to the University of Michigan Dearborn. But preservation requires resources. Roofs leak, limestone cracks, wooden beams rot in hidden places, gardens require constant attention, the powerhouse turbines rust when left idle. Fair Lane did not collapse dramatically, it weathered. Meanwhile, other symbols of the Ford empire vanished more abruptly. In 1962, the Ford Rotunda, a massive exhibition hall that once welcomed millions of visitors, burned to the ground during roof repairs. Photographs show smoke rising into the sky, steel beams twisting under heat. An industrial cathedral reduced to ash in less than an hour. Factories were demolished. Worker housing was remodeled beyond recognition. Streets lost the symmetry that once reflected corporate oversight. The empire did not explode, it dissolved. In Brazil, Fordlândia lingered in an even stranger form. After Ford sold the project back to the Brazilian government in 1945 at a massive loss, the town did not disappear. Families stayed, buildings were repurposed, children played in abandoned warehouses. The water tower still bore the Ford name, rust slowly softening its edges. The jungle began reclaiming what industry had tried to impose. The mansion philosophy had stretched across continents. Now it receded. At Gorkler Point, Eleanor Ford ensured a different fate. In 1976, she donated the estate to a public trust. The stone house overlooking Lake St. Clair became a museum. The gardens opened to the public. Private wealth became public memory. But even as doors opened, something else shifted. The narrative changed. Fair Lane was no longer a command centre, it became a historical site. The worker homes were no longer instruments of inspection. They became ordinary properties. Fordlândia was no longer a company town. It became a community living among ruins. The architecture survived. The authority did not. Henry Ford had believed systems could be perfected. Time proved otherwise. The turbines could be restored. The stone could be repaired. But control, once loosened, does not return in the same form. The empire had dimmed, and in its fading light, new meanings began to emerge. When control recedes, space does not disappear. It waits. Fair Lane stood for years in quiet uncertainty. Scaffolding eventually wrapped around sections of limestone. Restoration crews studied aging blueprints. Craftsmen searched for stone that matched the original quarry. Engineers reopened the hydroelectric channel, restoring turbines not to power a private estate, but classrooms and exhibits. The mansion that once demonstrated one man's independence became a public site of interpretation. Schoolchildren began walking through halls where industrial titans once negotiated. They asked questions that would have sounded impertinent decades earlier. Why did they need so many rooms? Who cleaned all this? Where did the workers sleep? The answers could no longer remain hidden behind polished narratives. Service corridors were added to tour routes. The stories of cooks, gardeners, and engineers slowly moved from footnotes into guided explanations. The house did not change physically, its meaning did. In Dearborn, the worker homes underwent a quieter transformation. Once tied directly to employment at Ford Motor Company, the houses were eventually sold to private owners. The direct link between wage and shelter dissolved. Front doors were painted bold colours that would never have passed early inspections. Lawns became gardens of personal taste. Basketball hoops rose where uniformity once ruled. The same brick walls that had symbolized order became containers for ordinary life. Children ran across sidewalks once monitored for conformity. Neighbours gathered without fear of evaluation. The sociological oversight that once shaped domestic space faded into memory. The houses remained. The surveillance ended. In Brazil, Fordlândia took on a second life that no corporate planner had imagined. The company had left. The rubber plantations had failed, but families stayed. Buildings once designed for American supervisors were repurposed. The hospital continued in limited form. Warehouses became gathering spaces. The jungle crept inward, vines wrapping around concrete, trees rising beside rusted machinery. Yet the town did not die. It adapted. The water tower still stands over the Tapajos River, the Ford name faint but visible. It no longer commands obedience. It serves as a reminder, an experiment in control, a lesson in limits. Across Michigan and Brazil, the pattern repeated. Architecture outlived authority. Structures built to shape behavior became spaces shaped by behavior. Fairlane now hosts visitors from around the world. Gawkler Point welcomes weddings and school tours. The worker streets function as neighborhoods rather than demonstration projects. The empire of design survived. The empire of control did not. Henry Ford believed that environment could perfect human life. Time revealed something else. People reshape the environments they inherit. They repaint them, reinterpret them, repurpose them. The same walls that once imposed standards now hold debates about history. The same corridors that erased labor now display its story. The houses became mirrors, and in those mirrors, new generations began asking deeper questions, not only about Henry Ford, but about power itself. Henry Ford did not believe he was controlling people. He believed he was improving them. To him, inefficiency was not merely mechanical, it was moral. Waste of motion led to waste of time. Waste of time led to weakness. Disorder produced decline. If factories could be perfected through design, why not homes? Why not neighborhoods? Why not entire societies? The logic felt consistent. At Fair Lane, servants moved through invisible corridors that reduced friction. In Dearborn, workers lived on streets aligned in orderly rows, their domestic lives evaluated alongside their factory performance. In the Amazon, an American town was carved into rainforest soil, designed to reshape culture through architecture. Each project followed the same sequence: design the environment, define the rules, expect behavior to adjust. Ford believed surroundings produced character. He was not entirely wrong. Environment does shape people, but control and care often look similar from a distance. The sociological department offered language classes and budgeting advice. It also inspected kitchens and asked about drinking habits. The worker homes provided plumbing and stability. They also tied rent to employment. Fordlândia built hospitals and schools. It also imposed foreign routines and dismissed local knowledge. Help and surveillance shared the same streets. Fair Lane demonstrated elegance and efficiency. It also erased labour from sight. The architecture was precise. The ethics were complicated. Ford's ideas did not vanish when his empire dimmed. They evolved. Modern corporate campuses now offer housing, gyms, cafeterias, wellness programs. Employers track productivity beyond the office through digital tools. Homeowners associations regulate paint colours and landscaping in suburban neighbourhoods. The language has softened. Culture fit, wellness, community standards. But the underlying question remains the same. How far should systems extend into private life? Henry Ford attempted to answer that question through stone, brick and timber. His answer was bold: as far as necessary to improve outcomes. History responded with nuance. The systems produced comfort and prosperity for many. They also produced dependency and tension. They revealed a central truth. Human beings adapt. They comply when necessary. They resist when possible. They reinterpret the spaces they inherit. No design, however detailed, permanently standardizes life. The jungle resisted dense plantation rows. Workers quietly subverted inspections. Families repainted their doors when oversight ended. Museums rewrote narratives to include erased voices. The architecture of obedience became the architecture of memory, and memory cannot be engineered. Ford's mansion empire now stands not as a monument to perfection, but as a case study in limits. You can build corridors that hide servants. You can design streets that encourage discipline. You can impose schedules in a rainforest, but you cannot fully program human nature. The river keeps flowing beside Fair Lane. The turbines spin again, but the certainty that built those walls has softened into reflection, and reflection is less rigid than command. The empire Henry Ford built no longer belongs to him. It belongs to whoever holds the deed. In Dearborn, some of the original worker homes still stand on the same streets laid out more than a century ago. The brick facades remain familiar. The sidewalks still trace the geometry of corporate planning. But the names on the mailboxes have changed. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren of factory workers now own houses their ancestors once rented under inspection. The link between employment and shelter has dissolved. The homes are private property, free to renovate, repaint, expand. Ownership changes everything. What was once conditional becomes autonomous. A woman sits at her kitchen table in one of those homes flipping through old documents passed down by her grandmother, inspection reports, pay stubs, notes about visits from the sociological department. She had grown up hearing fragments of stories, whispers about how carefully the house was cleaned before inspectors arrived, how certain questions were answered cautiously. Now the same house belongs fully to her. No supervisor evaluates her yard, no company monitors her habits. She can sell, she can preserve, she can tear down and rebuild. That freedom is quiet, but powerful. Across Michigan, similar decisions unfold. Some descendants choose to protect historic details, others remodel entirely, preferring modern convenience over preservation. Developers approach homeowners with offers that far exceed the original purchase prices of the mid-20th century. Each decision redraws the map of the old empire. At Fairlane, preservationists debate which version of the house should be presented. The original 1915 interior, later renovations, the service corridors that once remained invisible. To preserve a structure is to choose a narrative. At Gorkler Point, now known publicly as Ford House, visitors walk through rooms once closed to nearly everyone. The stone walls remain, but the meaning has shifted. Weddings are held on lawns that once symbolized exclusivity. School tours move through halls where private authority once ruled. What was once a family domain is now a public trust. In Brazil, Fordlândia lives on as a small town. The water tower still bears the Ford name, rusted but legible. Families inhabit houses built for American managers. Children attend schools constructed during the company years. The empire's footprint remains, but its control is gone. The descendants of workers, of managers, of immigrants who once arrived seeking $5 a day now decide what these spaces become. Inheritance is not only financial, it is moral. What does it mean to own a house that was once part of a system of surveillance? What does it mean to restore a mansion built to demonstrate control? What does it mean to live under a water tower stamped with the name of a foreign industrialist? These questions do not have uniform answers. Some choose preservation, some choose erasure, some choose reinterpretation. The mansion empire, once centralized under a single will, has fractured into thousands of individual decisions, deed by deed, room by room, garden by garden. Henry Ford believed in centralized order, history redistributed that order, and now the empire continues, not as a system of control, but as a collection of choices. The mansion empire did not end, it evolved. The specific structures Henry Ford built, Fairlane, the worker streets, Fordlândia, were early expressions of a larger idea, that organizations could shape not only how people work, but how they live. That idea did not vanish when the estates opened to the public. It changed vocabulary. In the early 20th century, control was direct. Inspectors knocked on doors. Supervisors walked factory floors. Company housing contracts tied employment to shelter in plain language. Today, the mechanisms are subtler. Corporate campuses provide housing, meals, gyms, recreation spaces, everything an employee might need within walking distance of work. Wellness programs track steps, sleep cycles, productivity metrics. Remote software monitors keystrokes and screen time. No one calls it a sociological department anymore. But the boundary between professional life and private life remains porous. Planned communities regulate paint colours, lawn height, mailbox design. Homeowners associations enforce standards meant to preserve order and property value. Employment packages include relocation housing tied to continued service. Gig workers rely on apps that track performance minute by minute. The tools are digital, the principle is familiar. Design the environment, set expectations, influence behaviour. Henry Ford believed architecture could reduce moral waste. Modern systems speak of optimization, productivity, engagement, culture fit. The language softens, the reach expands. In university classrooms, students analyze these patterns. They compare the Ford worker housing model to contemporary workforce developments. They examine how physical design and digital oversight intersect. They ask whether support and surveillance are distinguishable in practice. The answers are complicated. Ford's $5 day did improve lives. Company housing did offer sanitation and safety that many workers lacked. Fordlândia did build schools and hospitals, even if its cultural imposition failed. Control can coexist with genuine benefit. That is what makes it powerful. The same system that stabilizes can also constrain. The same design that comforts can also monitor. The same environment that supports can also standardize. The mansion empire stands today not as a relic of a vanished industrialist, but as an early blueprint of a recurring human impulse to solve social problems through structural order. The question has never disappeared. How much structure is care? How much becomes control? Fairlane's corridors once erased servants from sight. Now they are pointed out on tours as evidence of labour once hidden. The worker homes once linked wages to domestic behaviour. Now they serve as case studies in urban history courses. Fordlândia once attempted to export American order into the jungle. Now it serves as a reminder that culture cannot be engineered from afar. The map has been redrawn, but the debate remains, and as long as institutions seek efficiency and individuals seek autonomy, the tension between design and freedom will persist. Henry Ford built in stone. Modern systems build in code. The philosophy travels easily between them. For decades, the story of Henry Ford was told in one direction. He was the innovator, the industrial genius, the man who put the world on wheels. Fairlane stood as proof of success. The worker housing stood as proof of generosity. Fordlândia stood, when mentioned at all, as an ambitious but misunderstood experiment. But stories, like houses, change ownership. Today, visitors walking through Fairlane do not hear only about production milestones. They hear about hidden corridors and invisible labour. They learn about dietary theories imposed on guests, about schedules that shaped domestic rhythm. The mansion no longer speaks with a single voice. At the worker homes in Dearborn, descendants tell stories not found in corporate archives, stories of inspection visits, of carefully staged kitchens before evaluators arrived, of anxiety beneath gratitude. The $5 day was both opportunity and oversight. In Brazil, residents of Fordlândia have shaped their own narrative. The town is no longer framed solely as a failed corporate dream. It is a community that survived abandonment, a place that adapted rather than disappeared. The water tower bearing the Ford name now overlooks lives lived independently of the company that built it. Control of infrastructure once meant control of the story. That is no longer true. Museums revise exhibits. Archivists uncover forgotten documents. Scholars examine the sociological files that once measured morality. Filmmakers interview descendants who remember what official reports omitted. The empire of narrative has decentralized. Henry Ford believed in centralized systems, in singular authority guiding structure. But memory resists centralization. One person sees Fairlane as an architectural achievement. Another sees it as a monument to control. One sees the worker homes as stability. Another sees them as conditional freedom. Both can be true. History rarely offers single verdicts. The mansion empire now functions as conversation rather than command. Visitors stand in the great hall and look up at ceilings once designed to impress. They look down corridors once designed to conceal. They ask questions Ford never anticipated. Why this scale? Why this structure? Who benefited? Who complied? Who resisted? The house cannot answer, but it holds the evidence. And the act of asking may be the most important transformation of all. Power once flowed outward from these walls. Now interpretation flows inward. The empire has become a mirror. And in that mirror each generation sees its own reflection, its own concerns about privacy, authority, structure and freedom. The story is no longer controlled by the man who built the walls. It belongs to those who walk through them. Stand long enough beside the Rouge River and you begin to notice something simple. It does not care who built beside it. Long before limestone walls rose above its banks, the water moved with quiet persistence. It carved soil. It shifted paths. It ignored ownership. When Henry Ford diverted part of that river to power Fairlane, he proved something about engineering. Water could be redirected, energy could be captured, nature could be disciplined for a time. But even the Rouge flooded, even the turbines failed. Even the mansion built to demonstrate independence depended on forces beyond design. The empire Ford constructed was rooted in a powerful belief that environment shapes behavior, that systems can perfect society, that structure can eliminate waste, in factories, in homes, in culture. Fairlane embodied that belief in stone. The worker streets embodied it in brick. Fordlândia embodied it in timber and tropical soil. For decades, those structures projected certainty. Then time intervened. The mansion opened to the public. The worker homes detached from employment. The jungle reclaimed its experiment. The architecture endured. The authority softened. Today children walk through the Great Hall at Fair Lane and look upward, not in obedience, but in curiosity. They ask why a house needed 56 rooms. They ask who polished the floors. They ask how power feels when it becomes memory. No inspector stands behind them. No bellboard dictates their movement. The space once designed to instruct now invites reflection. In Dearborn, ordinary families cook dinner in kitchens once evaluated for cleanliness. They repaint doors without seeking approval. They mow lawns without fearing inspection. In Brazil, the Ford name on the water tower fades a little more each year, while life continues below it, independent of the corporate vision that placed it there. The mansion empire did not collapse in scandal. It transformed. What began as a centralized experiment in control became a decentralized inheritance of interpretation. Henry Ford believed he could engineer improvement. In many ways, he did. He also revealed a limit. You can design corridors to direct motion. You can build neighborhoods to encourage discipline. You can construct entire cities to impose routine. But you cannot freeze meaning. Meaning shifts. Ownership shifts. Power shifts. The river keeps flowing. It moves past Fair Lane as it did before the mansion existed. It will continue long after the limestone weathers and the gardens change shape again. The empire that once stood beside it now survives not as command, but as conversation. And perhaps that is the final transformation. What was built to shape others now shapes questions. What was constructed to demonstrate control now demonstrates complexity. The doors remain open. The turbines spin again. The water moves forward. And the story, no longer engineered, belongs to whoever is willing to step inside and ask what these walls were meant to do and what they became instead.